So I'm Kate Warren, and I'm here with Nick Williams of
Hi.
Inspired Entrepreneur. And Nick and I have been, well, we've been getting to know each other over the last year or so, haven't we?
Yeah.
I came on a workshop that Nick offered springtime last year. Found it a very inspiring experience, and found kind of your story really of how you've developed this extraordinary business. Also very inspiring. And since then you've been coming to things I do, and we've been developing some projects together. And I wanted to kind of share you more widely with people who don't know about you.
To be shared.
People who don't know about you and the work that you do already. And I guess what you and I were talking about earlier that I would love for you to speak a little bit about is, for so many people, whatever their line of work, there seems to be such a hunger, particularly as we get into our 30s, 40s, 50s maybe, for work to feel more purposeful and have more meaning. And I know you've experienced that in many ways. Your whole work has been about that.
My whole life and work for the last 20 years have been about that question.
So what's your perspective on that?
I suppose one way I would describe it is that for most of us, we're brought up to believe that work is pretty much both a mechanical and a financial and a material transaction. We work because we have to work to live, to earn money, to probably enjoy the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
But most of us have grown up with some kind of work ethic that says you shouldn't expect to enjoy work too much. And in fact, in a way, the more miserable you are sometimes, and the more sacrifices and the more suffering there is, the more that's real work, and therefore you deserve to be paid for it. So that's certainly how I grew up, and I suppose 20 odd years ago, 22, 23 years ago, I just felt there was this call in me to say it doesn't have to be this way. And we've all heard of the idea of having a calling or a vocation, but I certainly grew up thinking, well, if I'm going to have a vocation, it means being a minister and going to work in the church. I thought, well, that doesn't seem very appealing. And I guess for me, the last 20 years have been living my sense of calling. I was in a corporate job selling computers to Japanese banks, and yet there was this voice inside me.
I cannot imagine you selling computers to Japanese banks.
Talk about reincarnation. I feel like I've already had a reincarnation in this lifetime. I can't imagine that I ever did that, but I did. But it's this feeling, I had this feeling of like, there is another life in me waiting to be lived. And I think so many of us feel that there's another life in us waiting to be lived. And I suppose, like most of us, I just stood at a threshold and went, do I ignore that voice, or do I follow that voice? And I suppose I'd ignored it for a long time, but I found it got too painful to ignore the voice. And if I hadn't followed it, I think I would just be miserable, unhappy, probably an alcoholic, and probably a cynical old git that nobody would want to be around.
And then I wouldn't want to hang around.
We wouldn't be having this conversation.
Probably. And so you stood on this threshold, and I know so many people sit on that kind of particular fence of, I'd love in this life to do this type of work, or I feel I know many of my corporate clients enjoy the work they do and very much enjoy being good at it, and at the same time feel they'd perhaps like to work in a context that's more meaningful for them, like for example a charitable context or a startup business, and yet they perceive it as involving a kind of risk, and then being quite scary in a way to somehow there's a lot being given up. Now my own perspective is, it's not a lot to give up something you don't really enjoy.
No.
It's a relief.
How difficult is it to go to a job that you don't necessarily enjoy every day and leave so much of you outside it? So I think there's a difference between being skillful and having some kind of what I would call a heart or soul connection to what you do. Yeah. So skillfulness is a great thing. It's wonderful to feel masterful and skillful at what you do. For me, the greatest fulfillment comes from when you're sharing your unique gifts and talents with people in a way that's meaningful to you. So what I love about my life today is I do get to travel around the world to speak and write and do workshops. I'm using my talents in the way that I find meaningful and I know touches the lives of other people. Yeah. And I don't think that has to be a charitable thing. I run my life as a business.
Yeah.
And I think many of us, again, have got this split. We say, right, you go to work to earn a lot of money, but don't expect it to be hugely meaningful. If there's a bit of meaning, great, but don't expect it to be. Or go and work for a not-for-profit, because that will be really meaningful, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that split is true. No, I don't think. Well, I think it is for many people.
I worked for a not-for-profit, so I didn't get paid very well, and it was somewhat meaningful, not nearly as meaningful as the work I do now, which is massively better remunerated. So I think it's a lie, isn't it? This you can't have it both ways thing.
So that's right. So most of us have a disconnect between what I call it, love or money, meaning or money. And I don't think that's a real disconnect. I think it's something we probably learned, 200 years ago with the factory age, when we just started going to work as an act rather than as something meaningful. So my question to everybody watching this is just to ask themselves, so what would be meaningful to me? Because I think we're often even afraid to ask the questions. I know I was certainly really afraid even to ask those questions.
It can be very scary to start unpacking what you really want.
Yeah, because you go, oh my goodness, now I'm going to have to change potentially. Yeah. So why not stuff all this back inside and pretend I'm not, because I'm happy as I know
as
I
would
am.
call it, comfortably uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Not feeling great, but not uncomfortable enough to make a change.
No, and there has to come a point where something motivates us to change, and I think most of us change through either inspiration or desperation, and I know for me, I would let things get pretty bad before I was changing. So, I probably changed 85% out of misery because it just got too painful, and maybe 15% out of inspiration, but that inspiration was enough to help me.
And of course, it's not a requirement to suffer in order to make changes. It's, in the nicest way, you did that to yourself, right?
Yeah, sure.